The first thing I noticed wasn't the smell of turkey in the oven or the glint of fall sunlight on my son's front porch, but the silence, sharp as glass, when I stepped inside. Thanksgiving in Ohio, and the air was thick with the kind of tension you could taste. I'd rehearsed my smile in the car, gripped the pie box a little too tight, forced myself to believe this was what Lucas wanted. A clean slate, a rare chance to stitch the old wounds. It had been a long year, the kind that turns your bones heavy and your trust brittle. Still, I wanted to believe in the promise of family, even after everything. The last time I'd stood face to face with Lucas, his words had cut deep. "You don't understand how business works anymore, Dad." We'd left it at that, neither willing to apologize. But today was supposed to be different. That's what he'd said on the phone. "Dad, just come. Let's have a real dinner for once." I told myself it was enough. The driveway was packed. Neighbor cars nudged up against his silver Audi. Leaves pasted to their windshields. The world looked ordinary, almost warm. But inside, the house was staged for something else. Maybe an ambush, maybe redemption. Lucas greeted me with that bright, almost too wide smile, the kind he'd used as a boy when he'd gotten caught sneaking extra dessert. He hugged me, stiff, and I caught a whiff of his cologne. Something new and expensive. Nothing like the cheap aftershave he used to steal from my medicine cabinet. Amelia, my daughter-in-law, was there too, dressed sharp, her eyes scanning me up and down before her lips curled into a polite smile. "We're so glad you could make it, Jack," she said. I caught the faint tremor in her voice, like she was already preparing for a performance. The dining table was set for more than just a meal. There were fancy name cards, linen napkins folded into fans, flickering candles. Too much for a simple family gathering, not enough for celebration. It felt wrong, but I ignored it, dropped my keys in the bowl by the door, handed over the pie, and let myself hope. The familiar ache returned, the one that always showed up at family dinners. My late wife's laugh echoing from the past, the weight of everything I'd built and lost for this family. I walked past the photos on the wall. Lucas as a kid in his first baseball uniform, the three of us at Cedar Point, a blurry Christmas morning long before money became a curse. Dinner started like any other. Small talk, stiff laughter, the slow unraveling of topics. Business, real estate, the Bengals' losing streak, Amelia's new job. Lucas kept glancing at his phone, like he was waiting for some cue. I pretended not to notice, focused on the food, the clatter of forks, the normalcy I was desperate to believe in. About halfway through the meal, Lucas cleared his throat and stood. He lifted his glass, asked for everyone's attention. The room hushed, and I knew, with the certainty of a man who's been betrayed before, that this wasn't about forgiveness. He gave a speech about gratitude and new beginnings, his voice a little too steady, his eyes never quite meeting mine. I watched the way Amelia gripped her wine stem, knuckles white, her jaw set in a smile that was more warning than welcome. Then the doorbell rang. Two men in dark suits stepped in, their faces bland and unmemorable, briefcases dangling from their hands. I stared at them, not understanding at first, until Lucas nodded and said, "Dad, these gentlemen are here to help us with the transition. We'd like to talk about the company, about what happens next." My mind went blank, then burned with shame. The others at the table, their lawyer friends, a few work associates, suddenly looked anywhere but at me. My hand curled tight around the water glass, the sound of my heartbeat roaring in my ears. It wasn't just a family dinner. It was a setup. They spread papers across the table, contracts full of legalese and thinly veiled threats. "It's for your own good," Lucas said, his voice low. "It's time, Dad. You're not getting any younger. Let's keep this peaceful." I wanted to laugh, to scream, to flip the table and walk out, but I just sat there, staring at the contracts that would erase everything I'd spent my life building. There was a part of me that almost caved right there, a part that remembered teaching Lucas to throw a baseball in the backyard, the nights we spent up late doing math homework, the pride I felt when he graduated college. How does a father reconcile that with a son who now stares him down like a hostile witness in court? It all came crashing in at once. The years of double shifts, the mortgage I'd refinanced 3 times to pay for Lucas's tuition, the sacrifices I'd made so he could stand in this house and look me in the eye and say, "Sign this, old man." My throat closed up, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. But then something snapped. Maybe it was the way Amelia smirked, already celebrating her victory, or the way the others in the room started whispering as if I were already gone. I looked up at Lucas, really looked at him, and I saw not a son, but a stranger, hungry, entitled, and convinced he'd won. It was in that moment I felt the fear slip away, replaced by a cold, clear calm I hadn't known in years. I slid the papers back across the table, my hands steady now. "You're too late," I said, and my voice echoed in the sudden silence. "You think you've got this all figured out, but you don't know the half of it." A few people looked up, unsure if I was bluffing, but Lucas's eyes narrowed. He didn't like surprises. The truth was, I'd seen this coming. The slow erosion of trust, the way Lucas had been moving behind my back, the hints of betrayal that had piled up month after month. Shady new hires, strange activity in the business accounts, old friends calling to ask why Lucas was spreading rumors about me. I told myself it was paranoia, that a father's love could fix it. But love only blinds you for so long. Eventually, you wake up. And I had. Weeks ago, I'd started making calls, talking to lawyers of my own, meeting with old friends in back booths and empty parking lots. I'd sold the company to a third party, someone I trusted, someone Lucas could never manipulate. The ink was dry. My legacy was out of his reach. I'd kept the news close, not even telling my oldest friends, and tonight, as I watched Lucas try to orchestrate my downfall in front of an audience, I realized I didn't feel anger anymore, just pity. He looked at me, confusion flickering, his hands twitching as he reached for his phone. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I almost told him right then, almost laid it all out, but I stopped myself. Not yet. Let him sweat. Let him feel, for once, what it's like to stand on shifting ground. I stood, pushed back my chair, and the room seemed to shrink. The lawyers' faces blanched. Amelia's lips parted in a silent question. I looked around at all of them. Their fine clothes, the crystal glasses, the illusion of family, and felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I didn't know anyone here a damn thing. "You invited me for Thanksgiving," I said, my voice low but clear. "But you weren't looking for family. You were looking for a victim." I let the silence hang. "You'll get what you deserve, but not tonight." And then I walked out, leaving the house, the papers, and the ghosts behind. The November air bit at my cheeks, the sky bruised with oncoming snow. I heard Lucas call my name once, but I didn't look back. My keys felt heavy in my pocket, the metal cool against my palm. I realized, as I stood there on the porch, that the greatest betrayal isn't losing what you built. It's realizing you raised someone who could throw it all away for a taste of power. I started the car, the engine rumbling to life, headlights sweeping across the dark lawn. Inside, I could see movement at the window, Lucas's silhouette, Amelia's white face beside him. I didn't wave, didn't signal. There was nothing left to say. As I drove off into the night, the town lights flickered in the rearview, fading behind me. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Tonight, the war was only beginning, but at least for now I was free. When I left Lucas's house that night, the bitter taste in my mouth wasn't just from the betrayal at the dinner table. It lingered sharper and deeper, bleeding into the drive home, clinging to me like a second skin. The old truck rattled along the frozen Cleveland streets, headlights carving a path through the mist. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles ached. Somewhere behind me, in that brightly lit house, my son and his wife were probably already rewriting the story, casting themselves as saviors, turning me into the villain. It was always easier that way, easier to forget the years it took to build everything they now wanted to tear down. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly, past darkened storefronts and shuttered diners, places that had once been crowded with laughter and comfort. Eventually, I found myself parked outside the old warehouse on Shaker Road, the one I'd bought on a handshake and a prayer back in '93. There was a time when just the sight of that place would fill me with pride. Now it just looked tired. The security lights flickered against the corrugated metal, throwing odd shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt. I sat in the cab for a long time, watching my breath fog up the windshield, letting the memories come. When Lucas was young, he loved to come to work with me. He'd follow me around the shipping floor, trying to carry boxes twice his size, always asking questions about the machines, the numbers, the way freight got from Cleveland to Kansas City and beyond. I'd show him everything, let him climb onto the forklifts, even when I knew it was against every rule in the book. He was my shadow, my little echo. For a long time, that was enough. I didn't care about the hours or the money or the way my back screamed at the end of every double shift. It was all for him and later for his future. I remembered the first time he lied to me. It was a small thing, a story about missing money from my wallet. He'd been about 12. I'd caught him, finally, after a week of stories that didn't add up. He stood there in the living room, fists balled at his sides, tears in his eyes. I remember the confusion more than the anger. I kept asking myself, where did I go wrong? But then he apologized. He promised it would never happen again. I believed him. What else could I do? That's what fathers do. They forgive, sometimes because it's easier, sometimes because hope is the only thing you've got left. It's a strange thing, memory. You think you have it all arranged in neat boxes, birthdays, graduations, Sunday games on the radio. But then, in moments like this, the boxes burst open, and everything spills out. I saw Lucas at 16, leaning out the passenger window of the battered Ford I'd given him, promising he'd be home by midnight. Lucas at 22, beaming in his cap and gown, my heart full enough to burst even as I worried about the loans I'd taken for his tuition. I saw him again, years later, handing me a grandchild for the first time, his voice low with gratitude. All those moments, side by side with tonight, layered and messy, refusing to resolve into something that made sense. There were other signs I missed. The way Lucas would disappear for hours at a time, even as a kid. The time a neighbor caught him sneaking through the yard, looking for a way into my locked garage. I laughed it off then. He's just curious, I said, just restless. But now, all those little moments had grown teeth. I forced myself out of the truck, the cold biting at my skin. I walked around the building, my boots crunching on the thin layer of ice. The air was sharp, each breath burning in my chest. I stopped by the loading dock, where I used to sit with Lucas, splitting a Snickers bar, watching the sunset over the river. The dock was empty now, just a stray pallet left behind. The paint on the walls faded. I wondered if Lucas ever remembered those afternoons, or if they'd been crowded out by ambition and resentment. Back at home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked, steady and insistent. I poured a whiskey, just one, and sat by the window, looking out over the backyard. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the grass. I let the old hurts settle around me, heavy but familiar. I tried to tell myself that I'd done my best. That was supposed to be enough, wasn't it? But tonight I wasn't so sure. I found myself picking up an old photo album, the kind with the plastic pages curling at the corners. I flipped through it slowly. There was Lucas at 5, standing knee-deep in a pile of autumn leaves, his smile all teeth and mischief. Lucas at 8, holding up a trophy almost as big as he was, one sock slipping down his shin. I stopped on a picture of the two of us in front of the warehouse, arms slung around each other's shoulders, sweat streaking our faces. We looked happy, both of us, in a way I hadn't seen in years. I closed the album and set it aside. The quiet pressed in, thick as syrup. In the kitchen, I found an old birthday card, shoved behind the bread box. Happy 60th, Dad, it read in Lucas's blocky handwriting. Here's to more adventures. I almost laughed at the irony. I wondered what he'd say now, if he knew I still kept it. The phone rang, sharp and sudden. I let it go to voicemail. I couldn't face anyone right now. Not Lucas, not Amelia, not even old friends with their gentle questions and forced sympathy. I needed to think, to breathe, to let the bruises on my pride and trust begin to heal. Sometime after midnight, I walked out into the yard. The grass was slick with frost, and my breath hung in clouds. I stood beneath the big maple tree where I'd once hung a tire swing for Lucas, the ropes now rotted, the seat long gone. For a second, I let myself remember what it felt like to push him, his laughter ringing out across the lawn. The ache in my chest grew, sharp and unrelenting. I thought about calling him just to ask why. Why this? Why now? But the words stuck in my throat. Some things, once broken, can't be put back together with a phone call. Maybe not ever. Instead, I turned back inside and sat at the old desk in my study. I pulled out a battered notebook, the one where I kept the real records. The numbers, the plans, the hopes I never told anyone. I leafed through the pages, searching for some comfort in the routine of pen and paper. The company wasn't just a business to me. It was years of scraped knuckles, missed birthdays, coffee gone cold on the loading dock. It was the reason Lucas never had to worry, never had to wonder if the mortgage would get paid or the lights would stay on. That's what stung the most, maybe. Not that Lucas wanted to take it, but that he thought it was his by right. Like I was just a caretaker, holding the keys until he showed up and demanded them. The whiskey sat untouched on the desk. I stared at the liquid, amber in the lamplight, and wondered how many men before me had sat in this same kind of darkness, sifting through memories, trying to make sense of a child's betrayal. I remembered my own father, his silence, the way he'd stare out the window after an argument, never explaining himself, never apologizing. I used to promise myself I'd do better, be more open, more patient. But maybe all fathers fail in the same ways, just with different scars. The sun was barely up when I finally drifted off, my head pillowed on crossed arms. I woke to the sound of snowplows scraping the street, the world outside washed clean and cold. I got up, stretched, and forced myself to move. There was still a business to run, employees who depended on me, contracts to honor. Betrayal or not, the world kept spinning. But all day, as I answered emails and signed invoices, I caught myself glancing at the door, half expecting Lucas to walk in, to slam the past down on the table and ask for forgiveness, for understanding, for something I wasn't sure I had left to give. I kept replaying our last real conversation, turning it over and over, looking for a way I could have stopped all of this before it began. It would be easy to hate him, easier still to cut him off, to change the locks, to pretend the last 30 years hadn't happened. But hate doesn't build anything, and it sure as hell doesn't fix what's broken. So I waited. I worked. I tried to remember the man I used to be, the one who believed that hard work and love could solve anything. Somewhere in that endless day, a memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. Lucas at 14, coming home with a split lip and bruised knuckles, refusing to say what happened. I'd patched him up, sat with him in silence until he finally admitted the truth. He'd stood up for a friend, taken a punch that wasn't meant for him. I was proud of him then, not for fighting, but for caring enough to risk something. I wondered when that courage had twisted into entitlement, when standing up for others had become pushing me aside. That night, as the city lights blinked on and the world outside my window grew soft and gray, I made myself a promise. I would not be the victim in this story, no matter how it ended. The past was gone, and the future would not be handed away out of guilt or fear. There was still time to act. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I'd lost and what, if anything, I could still save. You don't really notice how fast the ground falls away until you realize there's nothing holding you up. For weeks after that night, I walked through my life like a man wading through a river that had suddenly turned to ice. My office, once a place of routine comfort, now felt like a stage after the actors had gone home. Echoes of old deals, the ghosts of 1,000 small victories, the silence where trust used to live. It started with the phone calls. Clients I'd worked with for decades, people who used to send me Christmas cards and photos of their grandkids, suddenly grew cold and formal. They hesitated before using my name. They stopped asking about Lucas, stopped joking about the old days. The big contracts, the ones that kept the lights on and the trucks rolling, began to slip away, not with a bang, but with a series of voicemails and polite apologies. I knew the drill. They were moving on, but no one would say why. At first, I told myself it was the economy. Maybe everyone was tightening their belts, maybe it was just the natural order of things, old dogs replaced by new tricks. But it didn't add up. Too many things happening too close together. A rumor here, a strange look there. The warehouse manager, Denny, stopped by one afternoon, awkward in the doorway, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. He looked everywhere but at me. "You hear anything about Lucas lately?" he finally asked. I shrugged, the old ache in my chest tightening. "Not much." "Why?" Denny shuffled, then cleared his throat. "He's been around, talking to some of the drivers, asking questions about operations, payroll, stuff you'd usually handle." I tried to keep my face calm. "He's just curious, probably. Wants to learn the ropes." Denny didn't look convinced, but he left it alone. I stared after him for a long time, something cold settling in my stomach. The next week, an old friend called late, his voice lower than usual. "Jack, you got a minute?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Look, I don't know what's happening over there, but folks are saying your company's not stable anymore. People are hearing you're stepping back. Health issues, maybe. I know you, Jack, but some of your suppliers are getting nervous." My mouth went dry. "Who told you that?" He hesitated, then said, "Just hearing things. Watch your back." "All right." I hung up and sat at my desk, looking out at the Cleveland skyline, wondering how fast your own son can change the story of your life. That night, I stayed late, combing through emails and invoices. I found little things: a contract edited without my approval, a bonus paid out to a manager I barely knew, odd withdrawals from the business account labeled consulting. I tried to trace them back, and every trail led to Lucas, or to someone who owed him a favor. Each click of the mouse felt like pulling a loose thread, afraid the whole fabric might unravel in my hands. The final blow came in the form of a thick envelope, hand-delivered by a courier with tired eyes. I signed for it, my name shaky on the page. Inside were copies of legal documents, drafted by a firm I didn't recognize, accusing me of gross negligence, of mismanagement, of endangering the financial future of the company. The signature at the bottom was Lucas's, clean and precise, right where I used to sign his report cards. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Betrayal has a taste, bitter and sharp, and I felt it in the back of my throat. I paced the living room for hours that night, the walls too close, the air too thin. I looked for someone to blame, someone to shout at, but in the end, there was only me and the slow, sick realization that love is no match for ambition. The television flickered in the corner, playing some late-night infomercial for memory foam pillows, promising better sleep. I turned it off and sat in the dark, listening to the old pipes groan, the house settling around me like the final notes of a sad song. I tried to call Lucas, my hands shaking as I scrolled through my contacts. The line rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What was left to say? That I remembered when he was 5 and tried to run away, all the way to the end of the driveway, with nothing but a lunchbox and a plastic flashlight? That I never once imagined he'd grow up to be the man standing on the other side of a lawsuit with my name on it? But I couldn't stop there. Some old, stubborn part of me refused to just hand over the keys and walk away. I started digging, calling old friends-in-law, talking to anyone who would listen. That's when I learned about the meetings. Lucas and his wife hosting dinners, inviting employees and clients, painting me as out of touch, unwell, too proud to let go. He was offering promises. Bigger shares, faster promotions, new blood, a future where everyone could win, except me. Amelia played her part, too. She'd been working the phones, contacting suppliers, suggesting it might be time to move on before things got ugly. She was always good at finding the soft spot and pushing, just enough to make people wonder. The more I learned, the more the memories hurt. I thought of the time I got sick and Lucas brought me soup, sitting at the kitchen table, watching the rain fall against the windows. That small, gentle kindness was gone now, replaced by an ambition that looked an awful lot like hunger. I started to see the patterns. How Lucas would drop by the office with coffee, making small talk, only to slip away to the warehouse floor, huddling with managers behind closed doors. He'd ask for advice, then use my answers to undermine me. He'd complain about my decisions to others, plant seeds of doubt, then watch them grow into fear. I'd been so busy worrying about the bottom line, I didn't see him laying the groundwork, piece by piece. There were moments when I wondered if I deserved it. Maybe I'd held on too long, refused to see the future standing right in front of me, stubborn and impatient. Maybe I'd loved the company more than the people in it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about business, not really. It was about power, and about what happens when someone you love decides you're standing in their way. One afternoon, I ran into Amelia outside the courthouse. She was coming out with a stack of papers, her eyes hidden behind expensive sunglasses. She smiled, tight and professional, like we were two strangers meeting at a conference. "Jack," she said, "I hope you understand. This is just business. Lucas has great plans, but he needs room to grow." I wanted to ask her where the room was for kindness, for loyalty, for family. But the words stuck. She nodded, then walked away, her heels clicking on the sidewalk, each step sounding like the end of something I'd never get back. In the weeks that followed, it became clear that I was being erased. Old allies grew distant. Some jumped ship, others just drifted away, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. I saw it in the way people avoided my eyes, the way conversations dried up when I entered the room. The business that had been my life was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Except maybe there was. That night, alone at the kitchen table, I spread out all the papers, the accusations, the contracts, the bank statements. I looked for patterns, for holes, for any sign that Lucas and Amelia had made a mistake. I forced myself to remember every lesson I'd ever learned, every warning my own father ever gave me about trust and caution. Somewhere in that mess, a plan began to form. But I kept it close, silent, guarded, just like they taught me in the end. The truth was, I didn't know if I could win. I didn't know if I even wanted to fight. But there's a moment in every man's life when he realizes what he's willing to lose and what he'll fight to keep. That night, I looked around at the empty house, the old photos on the walls, the battered desk with its piles of unpaid bills, and I knew I wasn't ready to let them take it all. Not yet. So I waited, and I watched, and I began to move my pieces quietly, carefully. Because sometimes, when your whole world is coming apart, the only thing left is to remember who you are, and to make sure that, when the dust finally settles, they remember it too. There's a kind of stillness that comes over a man when he's lost nearly everything, a stillness that sits in your bones, waiting. The days after Lucas's betrayal seemed to pass in a strange, glassy blur. I walked through the routines of my life, a cup of black coffee at dawn, paperwork spread across the kitchen table, calls from worried employees, visits from old friends who didn't know what to say. I answered their questions with a half smile, always dodging the truth. But inside, the storm never really let up. For years, I'd been the man who solved problems. I fixed broken machinery with duct tape and luck, smoothed over arguments in loading bays, made payroll stretch when the money was tight. But this was a different kind of fight. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Lucas and Amelia weren't just after the business. They were after me. They wanted to break something deeper than my bank account, wanted me to kneel and admit I was finished. But the truth was I wasn't finished. Not yet. One morning, I found myself dialing a number I hadn't called in years. Ellen's voice was soft but steady on the other end, the kind of voice that told you secrets and made you keep them. She'd been my late wife's closest friend, and when Ellen became a lawyer, she'd drawn up the company's earliest contracts, helped me find my footing when everything felt too big. We hadn't talked much since the funeral, but she knew the outlines of my story, enough to guess that something bad had happened. She listened as I laid it all out, the way a good friend listens, letting the silence fill up with meaning. When I was done, she didn't offer empty reassurances or tell me to forgive Lucas. Instead, she asked questions, sharp and clear, about every corner of my business, every deal I'd signed, every backdoor I'd forgotten. Ellen had a way of finding the seams in a story, the weak spots where truth slipped out. As I spoke, I could almost see her mind working, sketching strategies in the air. That afternoon, we met in her cramped downtown office. It was the same as ever, overstuffed shelves, legal pads stacked in precarious towers, the faint smell of cheap coffee and lavender. She had a file waiting for me, fat with papers. As we sorted through documents, a strange hope crept in. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't alone. Ellen was relentless, flipping through my company's history, probing for cracks in the foundation Lucas was so sure he'd found. She found one almost immediately. There, buried in the original trust agreement, was a clause that allowed me to transfer the company, under very specific circumstances, before any formal legal action could begin. It was the kind of line most people skipped over, too dense and obscure for anyone but a lawyer. But Ellen's eyes lit up when she found it. She explained in simple words that if we moved fast, we could put the company beyond Lucas's reach, at least for a while. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was what survival looked like. Not a grand victory, but a stubborn refusal to lie down and be beaten. In the days that followed, I became someone new, a man with secrets, someone who smiled and nodded while keeping a ledger of betrayals and possibilities. Ellen connected me with a buyer, a quiet man from out of state who understood what was at stake. The deal was complicated, the kind that required patience and nerves. But I found both, scraping them up from somewhere deep inside. The hardest part was pretending for Lucas's sake that I was still beaten, still floundering. He called sometimes, his voice half sympathy, half triumph. I learned to speak in riddles, to say nothing and everything at once. Meanwhile, I watched as Amelia made her moves. She ramped up the pressure, leaking rumors to the press, hinting at financial mismanagement, sending anonymous tips to old friends in City Hall. At first, I panicked, afraid their story would drown mine. But Ellen, calm as ever, tracked every rumor, traced every falsehood back to Amelia. Each mistake became another weapon in our arsenal, a file, a timestamp, a careless email. There's a quiet pleasure in turning someone's malice against them, in using their own carelessness as the thing that brings them down. Sometimes, late at night, I sat at the kitchen table, Ellen's voice on the speakerphone, and wondered if I'd gone too far. There was a line between justice and revenge, between defending what you built and destroying your own blood. But every time I thought about stepping back, I remembered the cold look in Lucas's eyes, the way he'd smiled across that Thanksgiving table, certain that I was beaten. I thought of the men and women who depended on me, the drivers, the dispatchers, the secretaries who'd trusted me with their livelihoods. I wasn't just fighting for myself. The days ticked by in a blur of phone calls and signatures. I learned more about contracts than I ever wanted to know. Ellen was a force of nature, chasing down details, keeping me focused. The buyer moved quietly, keeping his name out of every document until the last possible moment. We timed everything to the minute, building a fortress around the business. My role shifted, from boss to actor, hiding every win behind a mask of defeat. And all the while, Lucas and Amelia kept tightening the noose. They called for a board meeting, sent formal letters demanding my resignation, threatened to go public with their claims if I didn't comply. I played along, let them believe I was cornered. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, swallowing my pride, letting them walk all over my name, knowing that every day I held out was one day closer to freedom. But there were moments of weakness, too. Moments when I wondered if it was all worth it, if the cost was too high. Sometimes, I'd find myself staring at old family photos. Lucas as a boy on Christmas morning, covered in wrapping paper. Amelia holding a sparkler in the backyard. There had been love here once, enough to fill a lifetime. Was I throwing it all away? Or was it already gone? On the last night before the sale closed, I sat alone in my office, the clock ticking down the minutes. My hand hovered over the phone, tempted to call Lucas, to give him one last chance to do the right thing. But I couldn't. There was too much at stake. Instead, I signed the last of the papers, hands steady, heart thudding. I thought about what Ellen had said earlier, that survival sometimes meant letting go of the hope that things could be fixed. Sometimes you had to accept the world as it was, not as you wished it to be. The next morning, the deal went through. The company was no longer mine, but it wasn't Lucas's either. I walked out of the lawyer's office into the weak winter sunlight, feeling lighter than I had in months. There was a strange freedom in the loss, a sense that, finally, the fight was over, or at least, that my part in it had changed. I still had my name. I still had my dignity. They couldn't take those from me. But as I drove home, the weight of everything settled on my shoulders. I wondered if Lucas would ever understand what he'd done, if Amelia would ever feel regret, or if they'd spend the rest of their lives convinced that the world owed them something. The answer didn't really matter anymore. My part in their story was done. That evening, Ellen called, her voice full of pride. "We did it," she said, but I could hear the sadness underneath. She knew what this cost me, even if Lucas and Amelia never would. I thanked her, voice thick, and promised to keep in touch. Maybe I would. Maybe I wouldn't. Sometimes the only thing left is to walk away. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks, dreamless and deep, the kind of sleep that wipes the slate clean. The next chapter would start soon enough, but for now, I let myself rest, knowing that the worst was behind me, and that whatever came next, I'd meet it on my own terms. Thanksgiving always carries a certain weight, but this one felt different. Like the air itself was holding its breath, bracing for something it couldn't name. My boots left muddy tracks on Lucas's driveway, wet leaves sticking to the rubber as I made my way to the door. The world outside was cold, November biting down hard, but inside, everything was staged to look warm, inviting, safe. The illusion didn't fool me. I'd spent too many months now living with one eye open, waiting for the next shoe to drop. As I stepped inside, the house was already humming with a nervous energy. Candles flickered on the sideboard, mixing the smell of pumpkin spice with something metallic and sharp, like fear hiding behind cinnamon. Amelia greeted me first, her lips painted just right, her voice floating above the room like a rehearsal. I recognized the effort in her smile, the same effort I used to put into calming her when she and Lucas first started dating, when every little thing was a crisis. There was no crisis now, at least not for them. Only a plan playing out behind those perfect teeth. Lucas stood by the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand. He raised it, toasting me across the room, and I raised my own, more out of habit than belief. The guests that night were a carefully chosen audience. A couple of Amelia's colleagues, 2 lawyers in expensive suits, a neighbor I barely knew. None of my old friends, none of the people who would have known how things really were. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror above the mantel, older, grayer, maybe a little more tired than last year. But there was a steadiness to my posture I hadn't felt in a while, a calmness that comes from knowing exactly where you stand, even if you're standing alone. Dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation, stories about business, college football, vacation plans. Lucas played the attentive host, laughing a little too loud, his eyes darting from guest to guest, searching for signs that everything was going according to script. But under it all, I could feel the tension, the way the table seemed to tilt toward something none of us could see yet. Halfway through dessert, the show began. Lucas cleared his throat, the room going silent as he stood, the perfect image of a grateful son ready to honor his father. He spoke about legacy, about hard work, about the importance of family. He thanked me for everything I'd done, and for a moment, if you didn't know better, you'd think this was a tribute, not a setup. But then his eyes hardened. The lawyers produced a stack of papers, sliding them across the table toward me with practiced ease. The words on the first page glared up at me. Transfer of ownership. My hands didn't shake as I picked up the papers. Not because I wasn't angry, but because the anger had cooled into something sharper, a kind of clarity that cut through all the noise. I remembered, in that moment, a winter when Lucas was still small. He'd wandered out into a snowstorm without a coat, chasing after a stray dog. I found him huddled under a bush, lips blue, stubborn as ever. Even then, he hated being told what to do. Even then, he thought he could outlast the storm. Now, he was the storm, and he believed I was the one who needed saving. Everyone in the room watched me, waiting. The lawyers explained my options. None of them good. If I refused to sign, they'd take it to court, drag my name through the mud. If I signed, I could keep my dignity, or so they promised. Amelia reached for my hand, as if to comfort me, but her touch was cold, businesslike. I let my eyes linger on Lucas, searching for a trace of the boy I once knew, the one who believed in loyalty, in kindness, in the simple power of telling the truth. He met my gaze for a moment, then looked away. I thought about all the years I'd carried him, through scraped knees, broken hearts, the long nights waiting up for him to come home. I thought about the sacrifices, the late payments, the sleepless nights, all the things a father does so his son can have a better life. What none of us say is that it's never enough, not really. No amount of sacrifice can fill the emptiness that grows when love turns to resentment. I set the papers down, folded my hands in my lap, and let the silence stretch. In that silence, I heard everything. The pride, the disappointment, the cold certainty that whatever I chose, the story had already been written in their minds. But they hadn't written the ending, not yet. The moment felt endless. Time stretched out, each second beating like a drum in my chest. Then I stood, pushing my chair back slowly, the sound loud in the stillness. I smiled. Not a bitter smile, but something gentler, sadder. A farewell to the way things used to be. "You're too late," I said, my voice low but steady. "The company isn't mine to give away anymore." For a second, no one moved. The words hung in the air, confusing, unwelcome. Lucas's face blanched, his hand tightening around the stem of his glass. Amelia's mask slipped, just for a heartbeat, revealing something close to fear. I explained, quietly, simply, that I'd sold the business days earlier, transferring ownership to someone they'd never met, someone with no ties to any of us. The room erupted, voices clashing, the lawyers scrambling to understand what had just happened. Lucas's anger flared, his voice sharp and cracking as he demanded answers. But I was done answering. I picked up my coat, slipped my hands into the pockets, and turned for the door. Behind me, chaos. Amelia berated Lucas. The lawyers argued. The neighbors stared in awkward silence. In the confusion, I paused only once, looking back to find Lucas standing alone, shoulders hunched, eyes wide and lost. I wanted to tell him that I still loved him, that I always would, that love is what makes this hurt so much. But some words are too heavy to carry into battle, and some wars can only be survived, not won. Outside, the air was sharp, filled with the sounds of a city that didn't care about the dramas unfolding behind closed doors. I walked, not hurried, not triumphant, but free in a way I hadn't felt in years. My phone buzzed, first from Lucas, then from Amelia. I didn't answer. Their apologies, their explanations would have to wait for another day. The night closed around me, the cold biting at my cheeks, but I kept moving. I thought of Ellen, waiting for my call, of the deal we'd pulled off together. I thought of all the men and women who'd believed in me, who'd stayed when things got tough. Most of all, I thought of what it means to let go, not just of a business but of an idea, a hope, a version of the future that will never exist. Back home, the lights were soft, the rooms familiar and quiet. I poured a glass of whiskey, sat by the window, and watched the world go by. There was a peace in the aftermath, a sense that, for all the pain and loss, I had not been broken. I was still standing, still myself. Later, as midnight edged closer, I wrote a letter to Lucas, a letter I may never send. I told him about the boy I remembered, about the dreams I'd once had for both of us. I told him that forgiveness isn't always possible, but understanding can be. I left the letter on the desk, unfinished, the ending uncertain. Thanksgiving ended not with a bang, but with a soft, necessary silence. The storm had passed, but its echoes would linger. Tomorrow the world would look much the same, but I would be different. Stronger, maybe. Wiser, definitely. Ready, at last, to face whatever comes next, without fear or regret. Dawn crept over Cleveland in silence, the world blanketed by the hush of fresh snow. My house was still and heavy, as if every wall remembered the storm that had passed through. Sunlight glinted off the frosted windows, bathing the kitchen in a pale, tentative gold. Could have been any morning, but everything had changed. I stood at the sink, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, watching breath mist on the glass. The lines on my face felt deeper, older. My body ached, not just with age, but with the long battle that had just ended. Sleep had come in fits and starts, haunted by dreams of voices raised, of Lucas's eyes burning with hurt and confusion, of Amelia's smile fading into something brittle and sharp. I had expected to feel relief, maybe even triumph. Instead, I felt emptier than ever, as if the victory had cost more than the war itself. I wandered through the quiet rooms, trailing my fingers across pictures on the hallway wall. There was Lucas, a child in 2 big overalls, grinning under a 4th of July sky. Another shot, him at 17, arms raised in victory at a high school game, the world wide open before him. In each frame, I could see echoes of the boy he'd once been, the man I'd hoped he'd become. I wondered if he saw the same things when he looked at me, or if time had already rewritten our story as something else, something darker. Later, as snow began to drift lazily from a flat white sky, I bundled up and stepped outside. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of my boots on the sidewalk. I walked toward the old city park, its benches half buried, swings creaking in the wind. The air was sharp and clean. My breath rose in clouds. I found myself drawn to the far end of the park, to the battered oak where I'd once taught Lucas to ride a bike. That day he'd fallen hard, scraping his knee, fighting back tears. He hadn't wanted to try again, but I'd knelt beside him, held his trembling hands, told him that falling wasn't the end. It was how you learned to stand. He believed me then. The ache in my chest deepened, a familiar throb of grief and longing. I wondered when I'd stopped being someone Lucas could turn to. Was it the long hours at work, the missed birthdays, the broken promises to be home for dinner? Was it pride, or stubbornness, or just the slow, relentless pull of growing older while your children slip away? A flock of birds lifted from a distant branch, wheeling against the sky. I watched them go, wondering how long it would take for the cold to settle into my bones. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Once, twice, a third time. I didn't have to look to know who it was. I let it ring, the sound small and insistent in the open air. Later, as the city came to life around me, I walked home, footsteps trailing long shadows across the snow. The house was warm, but the silence pressed in. I made a second cup of coffee, not because I wanted it, but because it gave my hands something to do. I tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. The TV offered nothing but static and canned laughter. Every room was thick with memories. Lucas's laughter echoing down the hall, Amelia's voice on the phone, the scent of my late wife's perfume that lingered in the corners. I sat down at my desk and pulled out the unfinished letter, the one I'd started 100 times and never managed to send. The page was creased and worn, the ink smudged. I stared at the words. Dear Lucas, I loved you before you ever spoke your first word. I will love you long after this is all forgotten. I tried to find the rest, the words that would make sense of all the pain, the anger, the choices we'd made. But language failed me, leaving only silence and the unsteady pulse of hope. My phone buzzed again. A text this time, Lucas's name lighting up the screen. Dad, I need to talk. Please. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the reply. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, chasing after nothing. I closed my eyes, letting the longing and regret roll over me. How many times could a father forgive? How many times could he let himself be wounded and still reach out for the child he'd lost? The sun moved across the sky, shadows stretching and fading. I finally rose, went to the window, and watched as Lucas's car pulled up outside. He sat in the driver's seat, unmoving, head bowed. I watched him for a long time, the years between us unspooling in the space of a breath. He looked up, searching the windows, but I stayed hidden. I wasn't ready, not yet. Some wounds need time to close. When he finally drove away, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness, the kind that sits deep in your gut and refuses to budge. I wondered if he would try again, or if this was our last, unfinished conversation. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone find their own way home. The day faded into dusk, the sky streaked with pink and blue. Ellen called, her voice gentle, asking how I was holding up. I told her the truth, that I didn't know what came next, only that it would be different. She listened, offered no advice, just her quiet presence on the other end of the line. Sometimes that was enough. That evening, I walked out onto the porch, mug of coffee warming my hands, and watched the city lights flicker to life. Across the street, a father pushed his young daughter on a sled, her laughter carrying through the crisp air. I smiled, remembering the weight of Lucas in my arms, the feel of his small hand wrapped in mine. I went inside, finished the letter to Lucas. I didn't send it. I tucked it into a drawer with the others, a silent testament to love's endurance and the scars it leaves behind. I poured myself a drink, settled into my favorite chair, and let the darkness fill the room. For the first time, I let myself imagine a life that wasn't measured by what I'd lost, but by what I might still find: peace, forgiveness, a different kind of hope. I thought about the company, the years of struggle and sacrifice, the pride and the pain. I thought about Lucas and all the ways we'd failed each other, and all the ways we might still heal. The snow fell harder, blanketing the world in quiet. I listened to its hush, to the slow, steady beat of my own heart, and wondered at the strange, fragile thing that is family. How it wounds, how it redeems, how it never really lets you go. Tomorrow would come, as it always does, indifferent to sorrow or joy. I was ready to meet it, scars and all, and see what waited on the far side of grief.